July 22, 1991. Studio One, NBC Burbank. The lights came up on an empty stage for the first time in 29 years, and nobody knew if Johnny Carson would actually show up. 4 weeks, 28 days since his son Rick died on a California highway, thrown from his car while chasing the perfect photograph. 28 days since Johnny Carson, the man who never missed a show, never broke character, never let America see him crack, simply vanished. The studio audience that Monday night wasn't the usual crowd. These weren't tourists hoping for laughs. These were people who'd called every day for 4 weeks asking the same question, is Johnny back? They sat in those seats like mourners at a wake, quiet and uncertain, because nobody knew what they were about to witness. Backstage, Ed McMahon stood in his usual spot, but nothing felt usual. Ed had been Johnny's sidekick for 30 years. 30 years of here's Johnny. 30 years of laughing at jokes before the audience caught them, of filling dead air when Johnny went blank, of being the safety net nobody saw. But this was different. Fred de Cordova, the show's longtime producer, approached Ed with worry carved into his face. Ed, he's here, but I don't know if he can do this. Where is he? Dressing room. He's been sitting there for an hour. Won't talk, won't come out. I'm not going to do my monologue tonight, Johnny said, his voice barely steady. I'm going to show you something instead. He gestured to a screen behind him. The lights dimmed, and Rick Carson's photographs appeared, one by one. California coastlines, desert sunsets, portraits of strangers who didn't know they were being captured in moments of unexpected beauty. This is what my son saw, Johnny said. This is how Rick looked at the world, and I never knew. In 39 years, I never asked him to show me his work. I never asked what he loved. I was too busy being Johnny Carson. His voice broke on his own name. In the audience, people weren't just crying. They were gutted. Because this wasn't entertainment. This was a father confessing his failures on national television. Another photograph appeared. Johnny and Rick, maybe 1955. Johnny reading a story to a small boy. Rick used to watch this show every week, Johnny continued. Not because he liked the jokes, because it was the only time he felt like he knew me. The TV version. The one who was always funny, always put together, always knew what to say. Johnny turned to the camera, tears streaming freely now. When Rick was around, you wanted to smile. 4 words. Simple. Devastating. That's when Ed McMahon broke. Ed McMahon had been on television for 3 decades. He'd laughed through thousands of jokes, introduced thousands of guests, and maintained perfect composure through every moment of it. That was his job. Be steady. Be reliable. Be the rock that Johnny could lean on. But when Johnny said those 4 words, when Rick was around you wanted to smile, something inside Ed shattered. The camera caught it. Ed's face crumbling, his hand coming up to cover his mouth, his shoulders shaking as he tried and failed to hold it together. 30 years of professional distance evaporated in 4 seconds. The audience saw it. 23 million viewers at home saw it, and most importantly, Johnny saw it. Johnny stopped talking. He turned from the camera and looked at Ed, really looked at him, and saw his friend of 3 decades sobbing openly at his desk. Ed, Johnny said softly. Ed shook his head, trying to wave Johnny off, trying to say he was fine, but he couldn't speak, he couldn't stop crying. Johnny walked over to Ed's desk. In 30 years of The Tonight Show, Johnny had never left his mark during a broadcast. He stayed in his spot. That was the format. That was the show. Not tonight. Johnny stood next to Ed, and for a moment neither man moved. The studio was dead silent. No coughs, no whispers, nothing. Just 2 men trying to hold themselves together and failing. He had a laugh that was contagious as could be, Johnny continued, his voice rough. He tried so hard to please. And I never told him it was enough. I never told him he was enough. Ed looked up at Johnny, and what passed between them in that moment wasn't about the show, or the cameras, or the audience. It was about 2 men who'd spent 30 years together, who'd buried their own pain to make other people laugh, finally letting each other see the truth. Johnny did something he'd never done before on camera. He reached down and pulled Ed to his feet. I can't do this alone tonight, Johnny said, and it wasn't clear if he was talking to Ed or to America or to himself. Ed tried to speak, failed, tried again. You're not alone, Johnny. You've never been alone. Then Johnny Carson, the king of late-night television, the man who'd interviewed every president since Nixon, who'd maintained perfect professional distance from everyone including his own family, hugged Ed McMahon on live television. Not a quick pat-on-the-back Hollywood hug, a real hug, the kind you give someone when you're drowning and they're the only thing keeping you afloat. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay silent. Most of them were crying too hard to do either. Fred de Cordova, watching from the control room, had tears streaming down his face. "Keep the cameras rolling," he whispered to the director. "Don't cut away, let them see this." Because what America was witnessing wasn't entertainment. It was two men who'd spent 3 decades hiding behind comedy, finally showing each other and everyone watching what grief actually looked like. When Johnny finally pulled back, he wiped his eyes and tried to smile. "It didn't work. I'm sorry," he said. "This isn't what you came here for." "Yes, it is," someone from the audience shouted. A woman's voice, clear and strong. "This is exactly what we came here for." The audience erupted in applause, not the excited applause of a good joke landing. The kind of applause you give when you've witnessed something important, when you've seen someone be brave enough to fall apart in front of you. Johnny nodded, unable to speak. Ed stood beside him, hand on Johnny's shoulder, still crying. "I have more to show you," Johnny finally managed. Rick's last photographs. The ones he took the day he died. The screen behind them lit up again, and what appeared next would change how America understood Johnny Carson forever. The photographs that appeared on screen weren't what anyone expected. They weren't landscapes or sunsets or the artistic shots Johnny had shown earlier. These were different, personal, raw. The first image, Johnny's house in Malibu, photographed from the street. Not the glamorous mansion you'd see in magazines. Just a house, distant and unreachable, shot through the front gate. The second image, the Tonight Show studio, exterior, taken at dawn when no one was there. Empty, silent. The third image, a framed photograph inside Rick's apartment. Johnny and Rick from 1955. The same photo Johnny had shown earlier, but this print was worn at the edges, like it had been handled thousands of times. "Rick took these the morning he died," Johnny said quietly. "We found the camera in his car. The film was still inside." The audience held its breath. Another photo appeared. A close-up of a phone, Rick's phone, with a piece of paper next to it. On the paper, in Rick's handwriting, "Call Dad. Tell him about the gallery. Tell him you love him." Johnny's voice broke completely. "He was going to call me that day. He'd gotten his first gallery showing. He wanted to tell me, and I was in a meeting. My assistant told him I'd call back later." The studio was so quiet you could hear people crying in the back rows. "I never called back," Johnny whispered. "The accident happened that afternoon, and I never called back." Ed McMahon, still standing beside Johnny, put both hands on his friend's shoulders. Not for the camera, not for show, because Johnny was about to collapse. "For 30 years, Johnny continued, turning to look at Ed, "you've stood there and made me look good. You've laughed at my jokes, covered my mistakes, filled the silence when I didn't know what to say, and I never thanked you. Not really." "Johnny," Ed started. "Let me finish," Johnny said. "Rick's photographs, the ones we found in his apartment, there were hundreds of them, and you know what was in almost every one?" He gestured to the screen. A new photo appeared. Ed McMahon, laughing backstage, caught in a candid moment he didn't know was being captured. "Rick photographed you," Johnny said. "Not me. You. Because he told his roommate, and I only found this out last week, he told his roommate that Ed McMahon was the real star of The Tonight Show. Because you were the one who was genuine. You were the one who was real." Ed was shaking his head, crying harder now. "That's not true." "It is true," Johnny said. "Rick saw something I was too blind to see. You weren't my sidekick, Ed. You were my brother. And when I lost Rick, when I didn't know if I could come back here, the only reason I walked through that curtain tonight was because I knew you'd be sitting at that desk." More photographs cycled through. Ed arriving at the studio. Ed reading a script. Ed and Johnny in the parking lot, talking after a show, both of them laughing at something no one else would understand. "Rick saw us," Johnny said. "He saw what I couldn't see. That the best thing about this show was never me. It was us." The audience was standing now, applauding, crying. Some of them calling out encouragement neither Johnny nor Ed could hear over the sound of their own breaking hearts. Johnny turned back to the camera. "I asked Rick's roommate why Rick took so many pictures of Ed. And he said Rick told him Ed McMahon is who my dad could have been if he wasn't afraid." That sentence landed like a bomb. Ed grabbed Johnny and pulled him into another embrace, and this time neither man tried to stop crying. The Tonight Show didn't return from commercial that night. Fred de Cordova made the call from the control room. "We're done. Let them have this moment." For the first time in 29 years, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson ended early. No guests, no comedy bits, no good nights. Just two men standing on a stage, holding each other up, while America watched them grieve. The studio audience stayed, all 300 of them. Nobody moved toward the exits. They just sat there, silent, bearing witness to something they instinctively knew was sacred. Johnny finally pulled away from Ed and turned to face them. His makeup was destroyed, his eyes were red, and he looked every one of his 65 years. "Thank you for being here tonight." A man in the third row stood up. "You did something better than make us laugh, Johnny. You made us feel." Others began standing, not applauding, just standing. A silent acknowledgement of what they'd witnessed. Ed walked Johnny backstage. In the dressing room, they sat in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, Ed spoke. "You know what Rick was right about? I wasn't afraid, but not because I'm braver than you, because I had you to hide behind. You carried everything so the rest of us didn't have to. That's not weakness, Johnny. That's love." Johnny broke down again, and Ed let him. After 30 years of holding Johnny Carson together, Ed McMahon finally understood that sometimes the greatest act of friendship is letting someone fall apart. 3 months later, Johnny Carson announced his retirement. May 22, 1992 would be his final show. The character had died with Rick, and what remained was just a man who'd realized too late what actually mattered. On Johnny's final broadcast, after everything ended and the studio emptied, Johnny and Ed sat together one last time. "I have something for you," Johnny said, pulling out an envelope. Inside was a photograph Rick had taken years ago. It showed Johnny and Ed backstage, both laughing, completely unguarded. On the back, in Rick's handwriting, "The only time Dad looks happy." Ed stared at the photo. He saw it. He saw everything, Johnny said. "He saw that I needed you more than you needed me, and I never told you." Johnny took a breath. "Ed, you were the best friend I ever had. You stood at that desk for 30 years and made me better than I was, and I love you for it." Ed couldn't speak. He just pulled Johnny into one final embrace. Johnny Carson died on January 23, 2005. At his memorial service, Ed McMahon gave the eulogy. On July 22, 1991, Johnny showed America his broken heart, Ed said, his voice steady despite his tears. But what America didn't see was what happened after. When the lights went down, Johnny turned to me and said, "Ed, promise me they remember that you caught me." Ed's voice broke. I promised him. And I did catch him. Every phone call, every visit, every moment he needed someone. Because that's what you do for the people you love. You catch them. The story of July 22, 1991 became legend in television history. The moment when authentic emotion replaced professional distance as the gold standard. But for those who were there, it was simpler than that. It was the night Johnny Carson stopped being a star and became human. And Ed McMahon proved that the greatest performance of all is just showing up for someone when they need you most.